Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for listening. Today's date is May 28th, Thursday, 2026, and the time is 12:37 p.m. I'm in Miami-Dade County, Florida. Thank you for watching. Thank you for your patronage. We have a lot to talk about, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to be discussing Cuba today. This is your host, Emmanuel Isaiah Smith. And the title of today's lecture is Cuba, Terrorism, and the Gangstalking Connection, Part 16, Architecture of Narcotics Operations. And ladies and gentlemen, I'll inform you that I tend to do these lectures outside, and I may have to raise or project my voice ever so often to keep down any background noise. Please adjust your volume accordingly. Ladies and gentlemen, there's a lot going on in the island known as Cuba, this island that is 100 miles east of where I'm sitting right now in Miami-Dade County, Florida. Cuba has been the topic of much discussion and much debate recently, particularly concerning Raul Castro and his indictment for murder. Also, there's been quite a bit of debate as to whether or not President Trump is going to invade Cuba. Furthermore, there's a lot of speculation as to the state sponsor of terrorism designation that the Cuban state has. All three will be discussed today, ladies and gentlemen, but we must talk about the narcotics legacy that Cuba has presented to the global community, the world, ladies and gentlemen. You know, one crisp autumn evening in 1982, the president of Cuba, one Mr. Fidel Castro, was sitting in his home office in the presidential mansion in Havana, Cuba. He had a hand-rolled Cuban cigar, and he had a glass of liquor. And he sat down at his desk, and he began brainstorming on how he could make Cuba a more prosperous and stable country. Later that night, he tucked himself into bed. And that night, ladies and gentlemen, on that crisp, humid September evening in 1982, Fidel Castro went to sleep and he had a dream. He had a cocaine dream. And the next morning he woke up, and to his great pleasure, when he went downstairs into the kitchen, his maid had fixed him his favorite breakfast: sunny side up eggs, crisp bacon, two pieces of toast with butter and grape jam on top. Furthermore, there was a small tossed salad to the side with Thousand Island dressing and a little bit of cheese on top. He had a glass of orange juice. And as he began to consume his morning meal, he thought about the cocaine dream that he'd had the previous night. The dream impacted him. It shook him to his very core. After Mr. Fidel Castro finished his morning breakfast, he readied himself, preparing himself for the day ahead. Then he walked over to the presidential balcony and looked out at the wild blue sky. And it was then that Fidel Castro, the president of the island of Cuba, realized that he wanted to transmorph his cocaine dream into a cocaine reality. But there was a dilemma. There was an obstacle, ladies and gentlemen. Indeed, there was a problem that Fidel Castro had to overcome if he was going to make his fantasy come to real life. Ladies and gentlemen, his cocaine fantasy consumed every part of him, mind, body, and spirit. But he knew that he was not going to be able to do this alone. Fidel Castro knew he had to involve his friends in the East, his powerful friends in the East, to help him realize his cocaine ambition. He also knew that he'd have to get his friends from South America, Nicaragua, Colombia, Bolivia, Peru, and Chile. He knew beyond a shadow of a doubt and beyond a reasonable doubt that he needed help if he was going to realize his cocaine sueño. He had to get many governments involved because the government of Cuba by itself was not capable of moving 30 tons of pure white cocaine into the United States. He needed to involve his friends in the South, and he needed to involve his friends in the East, and he got them together and realized his cocaine passion. He and his friends in the East, as well as his friends in the South, particularly South America, were able to split the proceeds, sometimes up to $30 billion in a whole year, sold right here in the United States. He split it between himself, his friends in South America, and his friends in the East. And his cocaine dream became a cocaine triumph for Fidel Castro in his Cuba. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to talk about many different political matters, many different political conundrums, many different political situations. We're here to talk about state sponsors of terrorism. We're here to talk about narco-terrorism. We're here to talk about the various challenges that Cuba faces going forward. And it means something to me, ladies and gentlemen, as your host, because I'm right here in the middle of all of it. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it would be naive to think that some of the narco-terrorism that is spoken of by the executive office of the president, by the ambassador to the United Nations, by by so many government auxiliaries in this country, it would be naive to think that these activities have not spilled over into the United States. Because they have. And we're going to talk about them here today. There is a lot going on in Cuba. We have some current events for you today, ladies and gentlemen. And we also have some documents from the former director of the CIA, Mr. William Casey. And we're going to get right into it. There's a lot to cover. And there's a lot to share, ladies and gentlemen. So thank you for tuning in to Cuba, Terrorism, and the Gangstalking Connection, Part 16. We're going to begin with a press release from the Department of Justice concerning Raul Castro, the brother of the late Fidel Castro. It's dated Wednesday, May 20th, 2026. And it is titled, "The United States Unseals Superseding Indictment Charging Raul Castro and 5 Castro regime co-defendants for a 1996 shoot-down of Brothers to the Rescue aircraft." And it is published by the Office of Public Affairs. And it reads, "The U.S. Department of Justice today announced the unsealing of a superseding indictment charging Raul Modesto Castro Ruz, aged 94, of Holguin, Cuba, along with Lorenzo Alberto Perez of Las Tunas, Cuba, Emilio Jose Palacio Blanco, Jose Fidel Gualbarzaga, Raul Semanca Cardenas, and Luis Raul Gonzalo Pardo Rodriguez for their alleged roles in the February 24, 1996 shoot-down of 2 unarmed U.S. civilian aircrafts operated by Brothers to the Rescue, also known as Hermanos al Rescate, over international waters." So I'll stop at each paragraph and give you a rundown as to what it is saying. So the Department of Justice is indicting Raul Castro and a number of other co-conspirators for shooting down a plane. It was a U.S. civilian aircraft that was operated by Brothers to the Rescue. And this happened over international waters. This was seen as a extremely hostile act. It's debatable whether or not it falls into the terrorist category, but we'll explore that later. The next paragraph reads, in quotations, "Over 3 decades later, we are committed to holding those accountable for the murders of 4 brave Americans, Carlos Costa, Armando Alejandre Jr., Mario de la Peña, and Pablo Morales," said Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche. "For the first time in nearly 70 years, senior leadership of the Cuban regime has been charged in the U.S. for alleged acts of violence resulting in the deaths of American citizens. President Trump and his Justice Department are committed to restoring a simple principle: if you kill Americans, we will pursue you, no matter who you are, no matter what title you hold. So this paragraph was a quote that was issued by the Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche. You'll notice that we have an Acting Attorney General right now because the former Attorney General Pam Bondi was released by Donald Trump recently, and we have an acting Attorney General until a new U.S. Attorney General is appointed and confirmed by the U.S. Senate. And he's basically saying this. Regardless of how long ago this happened, okay, this happened 30 years ago, regardless of how long ago it happened, a U.S. civilian aircraft carrying U.S. citizens was shot down over international waters by the Cuban government. It is believed that Raul Castro was the mastermind behind this shoot down, and what he's saying is that the time has come to answer for this crime. It doesn't matter who he is, it doesn't matter his role, it doesn't matter where he sits in the Cuban government, and it doesn't matter who his brother was. He's essentially saying that regardless of his age, and he's a 95-year-old man, Raul Castro, he's being indicted for murder, along with several co-conspirators in the shoot-down of a plane carrying U.S. civilians. The next paragraph is also a quotation. It reads, "Today's superseding indictment of Raul Castro and 5 Castro regime co-defendants is a major step towards accountability in the 1996 murders of 4 Brothers to the Rescue members, including 3 U.S. citizens, Carlos Costa, Armando Alejandre Jr., and Mario de la Pena, and Pablo Morales," said FBI Director Kash Patel. "For 30 years, these families have waited for answers, and the FBI never forgot. We will continue working with our Justice Department partners to bring justice to those who attacked our civilians." So this paragraph is basically a quotation by the FBI Director Kash Patel, and he's basically saying that 30 years in the making is this indictment, and he wants to bring justice to the families of those who were killed, murdered by the Castro regime all those years ago. The next paragraph reads, "For 30 years, the family of these men have waited, and the Miami community has waited. Our country has waited, and today is a step forward toward accountability," said U.S. Attorney Jason A. Redding Quinones for the Southern District of Florida. "This passage of time does not erase murder. It does not diminish the value of these lives, and it does not weaken our commitment to the rule of law." So this third paragraph is a quote by U.S. Attorney, that's a federal attorney, very likely a federal prosecutor for the Southern District of Florida. And he's basically saying that the community deserves justice for this. And today is a step towards that justice. And he's saying basically that the length of time does not justify, or nor does it erase the crime that was committed. So it continues. Brothers to the Rescue, also abbreviated as BTTR, was an organization based in Miami that conducted humanitarian flight operations across the Florida Straits in search for Cuban migrants in distress. As alleged, beginning in the early 1990s, Cuban intelligence agents infiltrated the organization and relayed detailed information about its flight operations by the Cuban government. These reports were allegedly used by military leadership in planning the February 24th, 1996 operation. The superseding indictment charges conspiracy to kill U.S. nationals, 2 counts of destruction of aircraft, and 4 counts of murder. According to these allegations, on the 24th of February, 1996, the BTTR aircraft flew from South Florida toward Cuba. Cuban military fighter jets under the chain command overseen by Raul Castro fired air-to-air missiles at 2 civilian Cessna aircraft, destroying them without warning while they were flying outside Cuban territory, killing 4 U.S. nationals, including 3 U.S. citizens, Carlos Costa, Armando Alejandre Jr., Mario de la Peña, and Pablo Morales. The indictment further alleges that in the weeks prior to the attack, Cuban military pilots conducted training exercises designed to locate and intercept slow-moving aircraft. On the day of the incident, 3 BTTR planes departed from Opa-locka Airport for a planned humanitarian flight south of the 24th parallel. 2 of the aircraft, tail numbers N2456S and N5485S, were allegedly targeted and shot down in international airspace, resulting in the deaths of all 4 victims. If convicted, the defendants face a maximum penalty of death or life imprisonment on murder and conspiracy to kill U.S. nationals. And if Castro, Ruz, and Perez face up to 5 years in prison for each of the destruction of aircraft counts. The statutory minimum penalties are prescribed by Congress and provided here for informational purposes only, as the sentencing of any defendant will be determined by a judge. So basically, it gives the reader a rundown as to what happened. So from Opa-locka Airport, which is in Miami-Dade County, 3 Brothers to the Rescue aircrafts with apparently humanitarian aid missions left Miami and headed towards Cuba. And at some point, the Cuban military dispatched pilots to shoot down the 3 planes. Now, 2 of the 3 planes were shot down. 1 of the planes escaped, and these incidents are seen as punishable by death. And it's basically saying that the orchestrators of that massacre are facing life imprisonment charges, or excuse me, they face a maximum penalty of the death penalty or life imprisonment, and also an additional 5 years in prison for the destruction of the aircrafts. And these maximum penalties are prescribed by Congress. All right, so these penalties are being sent down from Congress to the U.S. Department of Justice for the murder of these civilians in these humanitarian aid planes. And that's essentially what the Brothers to the Rescue organization was. It was a humanitarian aid program that sent planes from Miami to Cuba ever so often, looking for people in distress, and they dropped humanitarian aid to them. So apparently the Cuban government saw these as threatening gestures and shot these planes down, these humanitarian aid planes that were being operated by U.S. civilians of Hispanic descent. And essentially 30 years later, the U.S. is ready to prosecute Raul Castro and those responsible for the shooting down of those planes with capital punishment or life imprisonment. The article continues. Luis Raul Gonzalez Pardo Rodriguez, age 65, of Havana, Cuba, is in U.S. custody pending sentencing later this month in the Middle District of Florida for making false statements in the Immigration Department. The U.S. Attorney's Office also acknowledged that the assistance of the Florida Attorney General's Office. We're grateful for the support provided by Attorney General James Uthmeyer and his team during this investigation, said U.S. Attorney Reading Quinones. Today's announcement is in conjunction with a ceremony at Freedom Tower in Miami to honor the victims. Participants at today's press conference, including Acting Attorney General Blanche, U.S. Attorney Reading Queen Nunez, U.S. Senator Ashley Moody, Deputy Director Chris G. Raya of the FBI, and Florida Attorney General James Uthmeyer. Assistant U.S. Attorneys Abby D. Waxman and Michael E. Guilfarb for the Southern District of Florida are prosecuting the case, with the investigation led by the FBI Miami field office. And then there's a disclaimer at the bottom. An indictment is merely an allegation. All defendants are presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. And that, ladies and gentlemen, goes for all crimes that are committed in U.S. jurisdictions. You're innocent until proven guilty. And apparently there is a reasonable suspicion among the FBI of the U.S.'s FBI, the U.S. Department of Justice, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and the Attorney General's Office concerning the destruction of these planes and the killing of the drivers of the planes. So we have a full-fledged indictment being handed down. There are a lot of U.S. agencies involved. It's the Department of Justice, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Florida Attorney General's Office, the FBI, the U.S. Attorney's Office, okay, and the Deputy Director of the FBI also. Also, there are assistant U.S. attorneys involved in the prosecution of this case, Abby Waxman and Michael Guilfarb. And that investigation is led by the local field office of the FBI, the FBI Miami field office. So we have a situation where these allegations are going to have to be answered to. And this indictment is real. Okay, it is not a fake indictment by any means. But it's important to understand the implications of this indictment. So what we're going to do next is we're going to look at a CNN article concerning these indictments, and then we're going to look at Google AI information on these indictments, and then lastly we're going to examine statements from the former director of Central Intelligence, William Casey, from years past, to help shed some light on Cuba's narco-terrorist past and how such an event was influenced by past terroristic activities that have been authorized in Cuba. And we're also going to talk some at the end here about the gang-stalking mechanism and how it's stimulated by such acts of terrorism. So we have this CNN article. This is from May 20th. And there are bullet points, and we're going to look at each one. The first bullet point says the Trump administration, and this is an article from CNN Politics. It says basically the Trump administration has indicted former Cuban president Raul Castro, age 94, on charges that stem from his alleged role in the 1996 shoot-down of two victim aircraft that killed 4 people, including 3 Americans. While announcing the charges, the acting U.S. Attorney Todd Blanche said President Donald Trump will not forget its citizens. Separately, the president said that the U.S. will make an announcement on the embargo against Cuba pretty soon. The Cuban government condemned the charges, describing them as a despicable and infamous act of political provocation. The indictment comes at a tense time for U.S.-Cuban relations, with the Trump administration declaring that the Cuban government is a threat to national security. Cuba is also dealing with the collapse of its energy sector due to an oil blockade following the U.S. attack on Cuba's oil-rich ally, Venezuela. So essentially, this indictment, it has been approved by President Donald Trump. He is in agreement with the U.S. Department of Justice and various others that these indictments are warranted and appropriate. President Donald Trump is basically saying that this is going to be justice for the U.S. citizens that were killed in that attack. And the U.S. said that it will make a announcement on the embargo against Cuba very soon. An embargo is simply a restriction on imports and exports. And the Cuban government has condemned the charges. They're saying that it is essentially frivolous political pandering and that the charges are not legitimate. And Cuba is facing a lot of problems right now, and it recently had an energy shortage due to an oil blockade following the U.S. attack on Cuba's oil-rich ally Venezuela. So the final part of this article ties into the removal of Nicolas Maduro from power by the United States. Nicolas Maduro was the president of Venezuela, who was found to have been participating and rather been a very active participant in South American narco-terrorism, including peddling narcotics and using his government and government resources to peddle narcotics into the United States. And a lot of the cash that was coming back to Venezuela from the sale of narcotics to the U.S. was going into Maduro's pocket and the pocket of his cohorts. Eventually, the United States got word and moved to remove Nicolas Maduro from power, which it did successfully. And Nicolas Maduro was taken away by U.S. forces, and he will be tried by the U.S. And Venezuela now has a new president who has gone out of her way to be friendly to Donald Trump in the wake of what happened to Nicolas Maduro. It was probably out of fear. I don't think this new Venezuelan president has any more of an interest of being friends with the United States than Nicolas Maduro himself did. And ultimately, this is going to spell a political disaster for the state of Cuba. There are many opinions and judgments being made on the aerial attack of 1996. Some people believe in the U.S. government that it was a terrorist attack. Some people believe that it was a simple act of aggression. Others believe it was a sound military decision made by the Castro regime. And some people believe that it was an act of war against the United States. But ladies and gentlemen, the United States has always been hesitant to wage war on Cuba, or rather invade Cuba, because of its potential to spark military action among other communist actors. Recently, ladies and gentlemen, probably recent is about 10 days ago, the People's Republic of China has expressed support for Cuba Now, me, ladies and gentlemen, you'll hear me say often when I speak about China is that I think it's a successful country. I believe China is a master of the communist political ideology and has implemented communism in a way that has been quite stunning. Ladies and gentlemen, my political views on Cuba are typically adversarial, okay? Because I see the direct influence and cause of Cuban narco-terrorism and its influences right here in Miami-Dade County. I don't fault China for wanting to stick up for its communist friend, its communist ally. But I hope China will see that Cuba has not been shy about its state sponsor of terrorism activities, and that those state sponsor of terrorism activities affect Miamians directly. And I hope that China can have a sit down, the government of China can have a sit down with the Cuban government and talk some sense into them as to how they should proceed going forward, because Cuba is very defiant. Ladies and gentlemen, I mean, going back 43 years, Cuba is a defiant nation. And the heads of Cuba, the presidents of Cuba, they've always been defiant to U.S. requests that they just simply put away the narco-terrorism and function as a normal country. Okay? Cuba is a known ally of many narco-terrorist organizations, particularly those based in Colombia. And ladies and gentlemen, I would like to see, here's what I don't want. I don't want Cuba to give communism a bad name, but that's what Cuba is threatening to do, okay? When you look at communism and its good and what it has to offer the world, it would be nice to be able to look at countries like China, like Russia, like North Korea, like Vietnam in particular. Okay, I think Iran has implemented communism successfully as well. It would be nice to look at these countries, these successful communist countries, and say, you know what? That's a triumph of human innovation in politics. Look at those communist countries and what they've managed to build, and how their innovations using the communist political ideology has benefited mankind. It's nice, even as a person who's always lived in capitalist countries like the United States, to look over at a communist country and say, you know what? They really have that down pat. They have it together. Just as if you were a person living in a communist country, I imagine it would be nice to look over at the Western world, to be able to look at the United States, to be able to look at Great Britain, to be able to look at Germany, France, Sweden, Italy, Ireland, and say, wow, those countries have implemented capitalism fabulously. And they have nice, thriving countries. I think people in general, regardless of if you live in a communist country or a capitalist country, you like to look at the other guy and say, wow, they've done a good job with what they have. Cuba threatens that, ladies and gentlemen, by refusing to put away narco-terrorist activity. Okay, I don't want to see Cuba cause other communist countries to look bad. Instead, I want to see Cuba make other communist countries look good. Because here's what's going to happen. If Cuba doesn't stop with the narco-terrorism and harboring fugitives, okay, and interfering with the lives of South Floridians in a negative way, using its narco-terrorism, what's eventually going to happen is people in the Western world and people in capitalist countries are going to look at Cuba's activity and say, wow, Cuba is really a hostile country, and they're a mischievous country. Maybe that means that all communist countries are like that. And that isn't true. That isn't true. I think Iran is on the United States' state sponsor of terrorism list because the U.S. Department of Defense, in particular, and the U.S. intelligence community thinks that Iran has nuclear ambitions and wants to destroy Israel with nukes. And that's something that the United States does not want. It's not something I want. I don't want to see Israel nuked. I don't want to see any country nuked. Now, I have said in the past, and I say to the present day, that I'm a believer that countries should be able to produce nuclear weapons so that they can keep their country safe in an event of a nuclear attack from another country. Okay, I don't think it's quite fair personally to say, well, we think these countries should be allowed to have nuclear weapons, but these countries shouldn't. If you're the head of state of a country and potential adversaries to your country have nukes, you should produce nukes to keep your country safe, and so that you at least have a level playing field in that regard. Okay? But at the same time, I don't think it's right for countries to threaten other countries with nukes. And I think that's where Iran found itself in a rough spot, because in 2007, I believe the president of the prime minister of Iran made a comment or another about seeing Israel wiped off the map. I don't think that's a fair statement to make. I don't think that's a healthy statement to make. I think there are better, smarter, and more productive ways of settling your differences with a foreign country. Okay, we all saw what happened with October 7th when Hamas, October 7th of, I think it was 2024, when Hamas, I'm sorry, was it 2024? I think it was 2024. Without having the data in front of me, I believe it was 2024 when Hamas carried out a massacre of 1,500 Israelis in Israel. And we saw Israel's response. They wanted to respond with shock and awe for an extended period of time to show how seriously they took that attack. You see? I realize the Middle East is a volatile part of the world. I know that it is very different than the Western part of the world where the United States is. And I realize that the challenges, the threats, and the ambitions of Middle Eastern governments, including Israel, are different than here. But it's beneficial to know that Israel remains an ally of the United States, and it remains an ally of many Western powers who don't want to see it harmed. What I would like to see is communist world superpowers like China and Russia, okay, North Korea, Vietnam, and so forth, have a sit down with Cuba in a conference and explain to the Cuban regime, its leaders, why narco-terrorism is wrong. I know that they're allies. I know communist countries look out for each other. But Cuba threatens to destabilize the communist world. It has got to stop using narco-terrorism as a political tool. Okay, you cannot shoot down airplanes with humanitarian aid in them over international waters. You just can't do that. That is a bad diplomatic strategy. It's a bad political strategy. It's a bad military strategy. That act could have gotten Cuba invaded back in 1996. And if other communist countries came to Cuba's aid, if the U.S. had have invaded Cuba, that would have sparked World War III right there in 1996. All right, if Cuba does not stop perpetrating acts of terrorism against the United States, we are going to continue to see military action, and it might at some point come to the point where other communist countries say, hey, United States, we are also communist countries and we want to take Cuba's side on this, back off. But if Cuba as a country, as a government, as a military entity behaves itself and is more diplomatic to the U.S., who has allowed one of its counties to become 60% Cuban American, then we can have reasonable and sane discussions, diplomatic discussions, in front of the United Nations as to what our differences are with the Cuban regime and how do we solve those differences in a common sense way. Then we avoid further tensions with China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, Vietnam, all the communist countries of the world. All right, common sense solutions is what I, your host, am calling for. And I would love to see the day where Cuba says, you know what, we don't want to be on any more state-sponsored terrorism lists. We don't want to be seen as a narco-terrorist country. We don't want to make communism look bad. We don't want to make our friends in the East, China and Russia, we don't want to make them look bad. So as a fellow communist country, we are going to use common sense solutions to real world problems. We're not going to shoot down any more planes. We're not going to pump 30 tons of dope into the U.S. We're not going to harvest fugitives from justice. Okay, we're not going to fund guerrilla groups from South American countries, okay, to protect dope shipments. Okay, we're going to be a common sense nation for real world solutions. And that's what I hope to see Cuba does, because if it doesn't, then Donald Trump is going to invade Cuba. He's already threatened that 3 times now. And it could possibly strain relations with other communist countries. And I think it was nice of Donald Trump to meet with President Xi Jinping of China recently to at least show the Chinese people and the Chinese government collectively that the U.S. is a common sense and reasonable country, and that it's open to having talks, it's open to diplomacy, it's open to real world common sense solutions. You see, I, your host, Emmanuel Isaiah Smith, have never been to China, I've never been to Russia, I've never been to Cuba, I've never been to Vietnam, never been to North Korea, never been to Iran. I've never been to a communist country, but I've done research, in-depth research on communist countries. And it seems to me that they are doing well for themselves at the present time, which is a good thing. You like to see countries do well for themselves. Capitalist countries are doing well for themselves also. You like to see countries do well for themselves. What my concern is this, ladies and gentlemen, is that Cuba is an X factor in global tensions between capitalist and communist countries. If Cuba minds itself and offers common sense solutions to real world problems, then we can avoid invasions. Okay? We can avoid all of this stuff. Now, what Raul Castro authorized in 1996 was not right. They shot down civilian planes from the U.S. that were trying to get some humanitarian aid to Cuba. I don't think that was right. My opinion is this: if the Castro regime did not like the U.S. coming that close to Cuba in planes without properly consulting the Cuban government, there are ways to communicate that. We're only 100 miles away from Cuba. All the Castro regime had to do was get on the phone and call President Bill Clinton, who was the president of the United States at this time, and say, "Mr. Clinton, how are you? This is Fidel Castro. I'm the president of Cuba. I'm calling you because I have concerns about U.S. planes riding in Cuban airspace or flying in Cuban airspace. Tell me what this is. What's going on? And why are planes from the United States coming into our airspace? You have not consulted with the Cuban government about this. We see it as a provocation. Tell me, Mr. President, that this is not a provocation." And Bill Clinton would have gotten with some of his advisors, and he would return with a statement to the president of Cuba and say, "Mr. Castro, these planes are humanitarian aid planes. We're looking for Cubans in distress. The organization is called Brothers to the Rescue. Okay, Hermanos de la Rescate. All right, and we are looking to give Cubans in need humanitarian aid from the U.S." And at that point, something could be worked out. But instead, the Castro regime saw this and said, "We don't like it. Yeah, those planes, they're flying slowly. They don't have any machine gun turrets. There's only 3 of them. They're relatively small planes, but we're going to shoot them down into the ocean. Because we don't like planes from America flying over Cuba." And that's what happened. They shot those planes down. They blew them up with missiles. The Cuban government dispatched Cuban Air Force pilots with probably F-22s. F-22 fighter jets flew right into the vicinity of those humanitarian aid planes and shot missiles at all 3 of them, missing 1, destroying 2 of those planes and killing 4 people. Okay, all of which were Hispanic U.S. citizens flying those planes. Now, this didn't make headlines. I mean, in 1996, I don't remember any news stories about this. I don't think the news media in the United States carried the story at all. But it would have been nice for the U.S. media to carry the story. Hey, Cuba just shot down 2 U.S. aircrafts in international waters. 2 humanitarian aid crafts. I would have liked to have seen that news story in the U.S. media for a while. But we didn't really see much about that back then. But now, 30 years later, the U.S. is getting ready to, it's already indicted a 94-year-old former dictator and his conspirators for that deadly encounter. And now a 94-year-old man who is a Cuban national, Raul Castro, is in danger of getting lethal injection here in the United States. All right, because of military indiscretions 30 years ago. So what we're going to do, ladies and gentlemen, is we are going to get over into some AI, articles. Oftentimes, I like to consult Google's AI, its artificial intelligence module, for information on historical and current events matters. These AI modules, they give you a summary of the question you ask based on an aggregation of data from several news sources. So we're going to look at this from an AI point of view. Okay, so the 1996 plane shoot down. The indictment centers on the February 24th, 1996 downing of two unarmed civilian aircrafts operated by the Miami-based Cuban exile organization, Brothers to the Rescue. The incident, the Cuban military MiG fighter jets fired missiles at the civilian Cessnas over the Florida Straits, instantly killing 4 men, Carlos Costa, Armando Alejandre Jr., Mario de la Peña, and Pablo Morales. As Cuba's armed forces minister in 1996, Castro is accused by the DOJ of overseeing pilot training for the operation and providing the express military approval to use deadly force against the civilian aircraft. There are 5 co-defendants, which include 5 former Cuban air defense officials and pilots, including Lorenzo Alberto Perez and Luis Raul Gonzalo Padro Rodriguez. There's a debate of terrorism versus sovereignty. The use of the term terrorism in this context is highly polarized and forms the crux of the decade-long dispute between Washington and Havana. And I'll stop there for a second. So you'll see the use of the word terrorism is polarizing because this act of military intervention took place in international waters. Probably fairly close to the Cuban border. And the debate is one of, well, is this an act of terrorism or is this an act of sovereignty? Did the Cuban military perpetrate an act of terrorism by shooting this plane down, even though it wasn't in the United States, it was in international waters? Or is this a matter of national sovereignty? These planes were approaching Cuba. Cuba wanted to defend itself and shot down these civilian aircrafts. You see, it's a matter of debate. For me, ladies and gentlemen, I just don't know. I mean, these were Cessnas. They were civilian aircrafts. They didn't have military capabilities. Okay, these were not fighter jets. Okay. So where was the threat? But then others might say, well, there may have not been an immediate threat, but they were headed towards Cuba in planes. So Cuba had the right to shoot them down. That's something that the Cuban government might say, but the United States sharply disagrees. These were Cessna aircrafts. They were civilian aircrafts. And the only thing they had on board was humanitarian aid. Okay. So it's hard to fathom where the threat was. Me personally, I think that could have been resolved with some diplomacy. Again, the Cuban government didn't too much care for U.S. aircrafts coming into Cuban airspace or even entering Cuba with humanitarian aid. There are communication channels that could have been used to express their displeasure. I think shooting that plane down was a hot-headed move on the part of the Castro regime, and it led to nothing but more tension between the U.S. and Cuba. I mean, keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, the Cuban regime has been on and off the state-sponsored terrorism list for 43 years. Acts like that are going to keep Cuba on the terrorism list. So we're going to look at the U.S. framework paragraph here. U.S. officials and Cuban-American leaders labeled the 1996 shoot-down as an act of state-sponsored terrorism and premeditated murder. According to U.S. congressional findings and prosecutors, the Brothers to the Rescue volunteers were conducting entirely humanitarian flights to spot and save Cuban refugees stranded on rafts in international airspace. Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche announced the indictment at Miami's Freedom Tower, stating that the charges will show the U.S. will aggressively pursue foreign leaders who kill U.S. citizens. So, this gives a little more insight as to who it was that was being helped. These are Cuban refugees. So these are people that are trying to escape Cuba, and they got stranded on rafts. And the Brothers to the Rescue was looking to provide those refugees with humanitarian aid, and those aircrafts were shot down. The Attorney General Todd Blanche announced the indictment against Raul Castro and his co-conspirators right here in Miami, Florida, at Freedom Tower, which is accessible by Metro Mover and by City Bus. And basically calling this a very provocative act. So the Cuban framework is that the Cuban government, led by President Miguel Diaz-Canel, forcefully rejects the U.S. legal charges as calling a political motivated fabrication. Havana has long characterized Brothers to the Rescue not as a charity but as a hostile narco-terrorist group. Cuban officials maintain that between 1994 and 1996, the group committed over 25 airspace violations, such as buzzing low over Havana, to drop anti-regime propaganda leaflets, which the U.S. government failed to restrain. Supporters of the regime argue that the shoot-down was a lawful act of national self-defense against a sustained U.S.-backed campaign of exile-led sabotage and terrorism targeting the island. So what we see in the Cuban response to this is that they were just sick and tired of Brothers to the Rescue flying into Cuban airspace. They thought it was extremely disrespectful and extremely hostile. Cuba, the government of Cuba, is calling these Brothers to the Rescue people, they're calling them narco-terrorists that are politically motivated, and that they have in the past flown low over Havana, Cuba, and dropping anti-Castro propaganda leaflets onto the ground. So the Cuban regime saw these Brothers to the Rescue organizations as more than just humanitarian aid people. The Cuban regime saw them as hostile political actors, and has alleged that this Brothers to the Rescue humanitarian force committed 25 airspace violations in a 2-year period. So what the Castro regime is saying is that we've given them enough chances to be diplomatic about this. Okay, 25 airspace violations in a 2-year period. That's 2 airspace violations a month over 2 years. The Castro regime saw it as a hostile provocation that the U.S. was perpetrating, and said, we are going to show the United States once and for all to stop meddling in Cuban affairs. And that's what they did too. They shot down 2 of the planes and killed everybody on board. And the U.S. is saying, we don't care if you don't like our planes. We don't care if you don't like our propaganda leaflets. And we don't care if you don't like us flying over Havana, Cuba unannounced. You are not going to shoot down our planes. We are going to indict you for murder, Mr. Castro. We don't care if you're 95 years old. You're going down for murder. Okay? So we have a geopolitical fallout. The unsealing of the indictment makes a sharp escalation in tensions under the Trump administration, sparking mixed international reactions. There are protests in Havana, Cuba, where tens of thousands of Cubans gathered around the U.S. Embassy in Havana to demonstrate solidarity with Castro. The Cuban military warns citizens to prepare for potential foreign aggression. You have a pretext for intervention. The legal analysts and human rights groups speculate whether the indictment is a first step in a broader strategy to designate Cuba as a foreign terrorist organization, potentially creating a legal justification for U.S. military actions or a capture operation. Also, you have sanctions and shortages. The move coincides with a near total U.S. energy blockade on the island, leaving Cuba facing widespread power outages and severe domestic fuel shortages. So we see 3 bullet points here concerning the political fallout of this, and quite frankly, there are a lot of Cuban people that don't like this. There are a lot of Cuban people that say, how dare the United States issue an indictment for murder against the former president of Cuba? Who does the United States think he is as a government indicting a Castro, right? So you have a lot of Cubans that think it's an act of bigotry, but that doesn't matter to the United States. The United States couldn't care less because, first of all, the United States has allowed millions of Cuban people to come to this country over the past 43 years. And the United States' mindset is this. Okay, so we've allowed millions of Cubans to come here in the first place from a communist country that we never really got along with that well. As a matter of fact, a lot of the Cubanos that came here did not have Social Security numbers. They had no job skills, and they had no way to contribute to the American economy. Furthermore, a lot of the Cubans that came over here from Cuba, particularly in the 1980s, were dope smugglers and had felony records. And they came over here to the United States, setting up in Miami, Florida, and perpetrating acts of narco-terrorism right here in the United States. Okay, they can complain all they want to. Not only are we going to indict Raul Castro for murder, but we're going to invade your country, Cuba. You wait and see. Not only are we going to turn out your electricity with sanctions and embargoes, but we are going to invade Cuba militarily if you don't stop with the narco-terrorism. Quit perpetrating acts of narco-terrorism against U.S. citizens here in Miami. And quit perpetrating acts of terrorism against U.S. citizens over international waters, Cuba. We're giving you a chance to do the right thing here, is what the United States is saying. Don't you dare riot in the streets of Havana, Cuba, against our indictment of Raul Castro, who authorized the shoot down of 2 U.S. planes 30 years ago. Don't you dare. Don't you dare complain about what the United States is about to do, because we have allowed Cubans to come to this country freely. for almost 50 years. And we have a sprawling county here, Miami-Dade County, a sprawling county that is 60% Cuban American. The majority of Miami-Dade County is Cuban America. Don't you dare complain about anything the United States is doing with respect to Castro, with all the accommodations and benefits that the United States has afforded Cuban refugees and Cuban people here in the U.S. Do not even think about rioting in the streets. Don't you even think about it. Why? Because the United States is saying this: we've been good to Cuba. We've allowed Cuban immigrants to come here as far as the eye can see. We gave you social security numbers. We gave you taxpayer-funded houses. We gave you work permits. We gave you SNAP benefits. We gave you welfare checks. We gave you driver's licenses. We gave you public housing. We've given you bank accounts. We've given you green cards. We've given you work visas. We've given you your own communities here. We've given you voting rights here in the United States. And this is how you repay us: by rioting in the streets. When we do an indictment against your former president for shooting down American aircrafts, how dare you? And that's the U.S.'s attitude towards Cuba right now. And there's basically speculation among the legal community here that this is the first step to labeling Cuba as a full-blown terrorist organization. Right now, it's considered a state sponsor of terrorism already, but they're trying to they're looking for reinforcements of that terrorist label, that it's applied to Cuba. That's what the legal community here in the U.S. thinks. And then this move will obviously lead to further sanctions and shortages. Right now, there's a U.S. energy blockade on Cuba, leaving Cuba with very little power. By designating Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism, it is now basically impossible for companies that do business with the United States to continue doing business with Cuba. Okay, and that includes energy companies, oil and gas companies, etc. And that devastated Cuba because a lot of Cuba's energy infrastructure, particularly its electricity, is generated by oil and gas. So the United States is very serious about these indictments. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what we're going to do here is we're going to look at a brief conference transcript. We're going to look at it. We're going to analyze it and examine it, and then we're going to close the lecture. This document precedes the events of the Castro brothers, and we're going to read about some suspicions concerning Cuba's role in international terrorism by the former director of the FBI. Now, this particular speech was given in 1985. And as I've always said, ladies and gentlemen, on a number of documents and narratives, we're going to have to go back in time so as to properly contextualize why Cuba has the attitude that it does towards the United States and why it's being put on the state-sponsored terrorism list. There's a history to it. There's a backstory. And understanding that backstory is key to understanding the events of the present. So we're going to read the remarks of William J. Casey, the former director of Central Intelligence. This speech was given by him before the 14th annual conference of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy's National Security Studies program at Tufts University. This speech took place April 17th, 1985 at the Royal Sonesta Hotel in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So this is basically a speech that Director Casey gave to an audience at Tufts University concerning concerns about Cuba's role in international terrorism. And it's fairly brief. The remarks that I've chosen to read. I have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 short pages. It begins, let us turn briefly to the murky area of collusion between the big drug dealers and the terrorists and their supporters. These two groups have radically differing goals. Drug dealers are out for one thing, money, and lots of it. They are above all merchants who wish to preserve their trade. Drug dealers see their interest at being the corruption and gradual control of manipulation of the established regime, to include the buying of policemen, security agents, judges, members of parliament, and even premiers. Money is the means and also the objects for the narcotics pushers. So this first paragraph has Director Casey basically explaining that money is the motivator for all narco-terrorism. Terrorists, on the other hand, are out to destroy the existing system. If they had their way, they would not corrupt the policemen and judges, they would kill them. Moreover, money is useful for buying weapons, paying operational expenses, and perhaps for buying intelligence and other information. But the terrorist is above all ideological, not mercenary. He is committed to overthrowing the established system. This said, there is cooperation between some terrorists and narcotics group for at least tactical reasons. A symbiotic relationship has grown between the narcotics dealers along the Caribbean coast and the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, who ordinarily would have little to do with one another. So I'll stop there. Basically, he's drawing a line between the motivations of drug dealers and the motivation of terrorists. Director Casey is saying that the motivation of drug dealers is money, and that they use that money as a corrupting influence, and that the chief motivating factor or the chief ambition of terrorists is murder, and that they would rather murder their way to success or murder their way to political change than corrupting their way to political change the way a drug dealer would. Furthermore, he's talking about the capacity of terrorists to want to overthrow. Okay, they don't want to rig elections. They want to overthrow the existing governments. And basically he's talking about there's cooperation between terrorist and narcotic groups for tactical reasons, and a relationship between the narcotics dealers around the Caribbean coast and the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia has grown, and they are teaming up and joining forces. So you have narcotics dealers and terrorists joining forces to achieve their financial and political goals. You see, that's where the term narco-terrorism came from. You have narcotics dealers and terrorists combining forces to achieve their goals. The drug merchant needs a secure transit point for his goods to reach markets in the United States. One such transit point is Cuba. The Cubans funnel arms and money to the guerrilla groups through drug merchant channels. And although Fidel Castro, in interviews with American journalists, roundly denies having dealings with drug merchants, we've caught him red-handed. By helping drug dealers push cocaine and marijuana, Castro gains improved access to the Cuban community in South Florida, contributes to crime and disorder in the United States, and aids his revolutionary offspring in Colombia. So we'll stop there. So basically, Director Casey is saying that Fidel Castro is undeniably an actor in these narco-terrorist operations, and that he was caught red-handed using state resources to distribute cocaine and marijuana to the U.S. And that all of those news interviews he gave with American journalists where he said that he was not an international drug smuggler were a lie. He continues, Director Casey continues, simply we caught the Sandinista government in Nicaragua red-handed in narcotics production and trafficking between Colombia and Miami, apparently looking for money which we have seen deposited in Panama and used to bolster their sagging economy. So he's basically saying that we also caught the Sandinista government producing narcotics and sending them to the U.S., particularly Miami, and it's looking for the cash rewards that come from such activities. Terrorist methods are becoming more sophisticated. Explosives remotely detonated or set off by a fanatical suicidal vehicle driver are examples of both technical and tactical innovation. Dangers from terrorism are greatly enhanced by the involvement of governments in the planning, financing, training, documentation, and providing of safe haven for terrorist groups. They're able to use more sophisticated techniques, draw on state-funded training programs, and use more violent, more deadly, more difficult to detect weapons. They have better intelligence and planning, official travel documents, and diplomatic cover to mask their true identities. Their movements and munitions deliveries. They can get safe haven in a sponsoring state after an attack. So basically, he's talking about Cuba as a harvester or a safe haven for terrorists, and he considers that in itself terrorist activity. He continues, radical states see in terrorism the potential for obtaining confessions they could never get by traditional diplomatic means. Our ability to endure in our policies is called into question and confused by terrorism. Our decision processes are disrupted. Confidence in the workability of our institutions is eroded. It can impair our international credibility as it did in the Iranian hostage crisis 5 years ago. And perhaps worst of all, it has become a tempting instrument to accelerate social, political, and economic collapse. In some countries in the third world, small numbers of revolutionaries, unable to win popular support through the ballot box, have succeeded in converting a moderate and democratic climate of opinion into one that encourages violence and counter-violence, with the resultant breakdown in paramilitary institutions. So what he's saying in these paragraphs is that terrorism is a shortcut to achieving your political objectives. For various narco-terrorist regimes in South America in particular, and in the Caribbean, terrorism is a substitute for political popularity. You don't have to win at the ballot box when you can pick up M16 machine guns and basically shoot your way into the presidency, or shoot your way into Congress, or shoot your way into Parliament, or shoot your way into a premiership, or shoot your way into a sitting government, and essentially stage a coup d'etat and seize power that way. So he's basically talking about how undemocratic terrorism is, and it's not about the will of the people. Furthermore, he's saying that rather than democracy, fear is used as a way to control the masses. Okay, he continues that clearly the Soviet Union and its allies see the potential of terrorist movements for disrupting societies. They see that throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America, there are weak governments with low levels of legitimacy and high levels of instability. They understand that these governments are actively vulnerable to terrorist disruptions and are good targets for terrorist campaigns. We must not be confused about the difference between insurgency and terrorism. Insurgency openly uses armed conflicts as a means for seeking concessions from a dictatorial or totalitarian government that has denied peaceful forms of redress of grievances or civic change. And can readily be distinguished from a group that attacks a democratic society by hostage taking, by suitcases filled with explosives, suitcase filled with explosives, or board airliners full of innocent people. So I'll stop there. Director Casey is distinguishing between an insurgency and a terrorism campaign. An insurgency is about rebelling, or rather using open-air violence against a dictatorial or totalitarian regime to remove that dictator from power. Where on the other hand, terrorists basically try to cause political change by using fear, intimidation, and so forth, such as hostage taking and blowing up stuff. So how do we cope with these small bands of highly trained people? Most of them fanatics, many ready to give up life itself to do their evil work. Increasingly sophisticated as they move around the world, crossing borders with officially and professionally prepared papers, knowing that they will have no problem obtaining weapons, explosives, and whatever else they will be able to find. Protection and sanctuary prearranged for them. We can combat this only with the highest professionalism, dedication, and diligence. So essentially what he's saying is that it's going to take strategy, and it's going to take essentially an architecture of readiness. It's going to take basically a blueprint of readiness to combat these threats to American sovereignty, particularly through international dope peddling. So he's basically telling people to be aware, be vigilant, and that such a matter must be resolved using the totality of the U.S. federal government. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's the end of those paragraphs. But I'd like to say a brief word on how these matters factor in to clandestine gang stalking. Ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, these matters factor into gang stalking because narco-terrorists use gang stalking signaling mechanism to watch after each other. Okay, gang stalking is a state-sanctioned signaling mechanism, attack protocol, and basically a way of maneuvering and communicating without other people getting wise to what you're doing and what you're saying. This is very appealing to drug dealers. It's very appealing to narco-terrorists. It's very appealing to people who need to speak in silence, who need to move in silence, who need to do their dirt in silence. Okay, narco-terrorism here in Miami has persisted since the 1980s. It has continued on to the present day. And there are a lot of narco-terrorists and other similar deleterious persons operating here in Miami-Dade County, Florida right now today, who communicate using a number of mechanisms that are quite frankly foolish because they're discoverable. And I, your host, Emmanuel Isaiah Smith, have discovered many of these gang stalking tactics, and I have worked to get this information out to you, and I will continue to do so on a daily basis using the power of the internet and using various digital and electronic mediums. And I appreciate your patronage and for listening, and let's hope that the future Cuba is better than the present Cuba. Thank you for tuning in, ladies and gentlemen.